and there became a lot more savanna. And our ancestors, the data indicates that our ancestors moved out into the savanna around that time. Climate was changing quite a lot, back and forth a little bit. But we were, savannas are not particularly, compared to a jungle where there's plenty of places to hide and run and so on. So these are dangerous places, the savanna, the openness of the savanna. And so dangerous places. And our ancestors didn't have fangs or claws, sorts of things that a number of other animals are not, they didn't have speed. And so how did they survive? How could they survive? There were other animals that had all sorts of adaptations to go survive out there in the dangerous savannas. Our ancestors didn't have those kinds of things, but one thing they did have, was each other. And they were in small groups with each other. In order to survive in these small groups, in order to thrive in these small groups, they needed each other. That is one of the things that they had, the secular scientists are saying. And so the kinds of traits that were important in terms of living in those small groups are especially interesting. Let's talk about a few of them. So this book, Mothers and Others, is a very fine book which is talking about this issue of the uniqueness of the human heritage, and the Creative Spark is, again, Augustin Fuentes is very helpful on this. Let's just talk, the author Sarah Hardy talks about one of the things that is especially unique in the interaction between a mother and her child in great apes, orangutans and gorillas and chimpanzees, is that the mother, and only the mother, cares for that child, and the child latches on and is carried around by the mother for as long as 8 years, a long period of time, and it's just the mother and the baby, and even the young juvenile. In the case of humans, of course, it's different. In the case of humans, they are closely attached to their mother for a period of time, but then they're weaned when they're 2 or 3 years of age. And not only that, but there's other factors that are unique, unlike the situation with respect to, say, horses or macaque monkeys, which when they're born, horses are often running within 9 hours, and the macaque monkeys are able to grab hold of their mother almost right away, and be carried away, and have the strength to be carried away. Our situation, on the other hand, we have much larger brains, and those brains take a long time to develop. The young are dependent on others for a much longer time. The mother is maybe having another child by the time the child is 2 or 3. It takes months before the babies can hold themselves up. It takes years before they can walk well, and even longer before they can run efficiently. They are dependent upon a community to survive for a decade and a half or so. And so we have a situation, and this is what a number of people focus on, a number of the authors are focusing on. Sarah Hardy and her Mothers and Others is one of the great ones, but a number of others focus on it as well. In order for our ancestors to survive, given that the babies have a larger brain, they are very, very dependent. The mother has gone on to have another child fairly soon. They're at that vulnerable stage. They need each other. They need to be caring for each other. And so, for example, most people think that the reason why humans alone have menopause is the significance of grandmothers in helping with child care. And so the grandmothers are kept alive. Our genes keep the grandmothers alive for a period well beyond their reproductive age. because it's important, people say, for a community. And we have each other in terms of others in the group, siblings and relatives and others as well that are caring. And if there was a group that didn't have this kind of thing, that group would not thrive in this environment. In order to thrive, the kinds of qualities that were needed in order to thrive, the kinds of genes that were needed, genetic makeup, was the kind of genetic makeup that would result in caring. And if somebody turned out not to be trustworthy, if somebody turned out to be a bully, if somebody didn't fit in nicely into these little communities, we know how that goes. And that is, they would not be able to be as successful in passing on their genes because of the fact that they aren't fitting into the community like they need to fit in. The kinds of qualities they're selected for, the kinds of changes that are occurring during this time are the kinds of changes that are associated with group dynamics and getting along in groups and caring for children and caring for the vulnerable and so on was important in order it comes. And so there's this sense of right and wrong beginning to develop. This is how we work in groups. These are the kinds of qualities that we're going to have if we're going to, and so groups that don't have that, individuals that don't have that, are individuals, not individuals that will thrive, but individuals that will struggle to stay alive and may well not be anywhere near as efficient, or at least not as efficient at passing on their genes. In our case, great book here on the left, Darwin's Unfinished Symphony. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that become apparent. It becomes apparent somewhere around the time that 2 million, 1.8 million years ago, that we especially became, that we moved from plants and tubers and plants, fruit, tubers, and especially began to move initially as scavengers, but into the world of eating meat. And initially as scavengers, they can tell whether we were scavengers, or whether our ancestors were scavengers, or whether they were hunters, by the kinds of, if we're scavengers, then the tooth marks of carnivores are underneath, and the tool marks of our ancestors, the tool marks of scrapers and cleaning of the bones, they're on top of the tooth marks from carnivores. So that's the sort of way in which they know that we were initially scavengers. Our ancestors were initially scavengers. And so to begin with then, scavenging meat and small, living in these little communities, and the need for tools. And so here's a stone tool here, a wooden tool over here. And so the need for tools and making those tools. The kinds of tools that were made are not, that we find from around 1.8 or so million years ago, something like that, I can't remember exactly, are tools that are not, I mean, this looks like a pretty simple thing to make. It's not simple to make. It takes finding just the right kind of rock. It takes hitting the rock at just the right angle and just the right way. It can take, so people who do these kinds of experiments, anthropologists that do these kinds of experiments, it takes graduate students or students who are learning how to make these primitive tools. It takes them a long time to learn how to do it just right. There was a lot of talent involved in making something like that. And so the formation of these tools and the significance of being able to make tools, being able to communicate with each other, being able to teach each other, probably the rudiments of language beginning. In fact, it turns out that the region of the brain that is important in language is right next to the sorts of the region of the brain that is used in making tools. These kinds of experiments have been done by brain imaging. And so communication, patience, and relationships developing. And as time went by, hunting we were no longer, our ancestors were not only scavengers, but they were the hunters itself, which resulted in fancier tools and the need for fancier tools and the need for looking out for each other as they cleaned off their kill, and they had people, some individuals would have to watch, the vision, you're going to do this. You're going to watch for any animals, any lions that are coming by, or you're going to watch for this. So the communication with each other was specialization of jobs, teaching and talking and so on. And so the kinds of things that would be needed And individuals who are good at it, individuals who are good at cooperating, individuals who are good at working in communities, those kinds of genes, that kind of genetic makeup that leads to that are the kinds of things that made us so unique as a special, as a species. Okay, I'm going to finish up here. I've only got about 4 more minutes, and I'll finish up because I want to make sure I leave lots of time for questions. The significance of fire, which it had a lot of advantages related to. This is a great book, 10 years ago, and significance of fire in terms of being able to cook the meat and make the nutrition and make it much more the calories much more available. So you didn't have to chew and chew and chew. The calories were much more available. That was an extremely important. A number of people think it was really important. Our brains require. The human brain, 25%, even though the size of our brain is pretty tiny, and yet 25%, about the size of this, 25% of the energy that we bring in every day is used to run the brain. And so in order for the brain to grow, good nutrition was important. And fire was almost certainly extremely important in allowing our brain to grow because of the increased efficiency of making nutrients available. And not only that, you know the kinds of things that happen around campfires. You know the kinds of stories that are told, and a sense of almost compassion and love that forms as you're sitting around. These are factors. These are qualities that were being developed throughout this whole process. This is what made us human. The genetic makeup that leads to these kinds of traits are what made us human. So. I would love to tell you a little bit about this particular slide. I think I will. This is some amazing story. When you compare the intelligence, and there's various ways that they can do. I mean, how can you possibly compare intelligence of a child? There's tests that are done by psychologists that allow them to recognize the fact that orangutans are orangutans and chimps are chimps, but nonetheless they can check for various intellectual qualities that these great apes have compared to the human. And when you look at those kind of other general kinds of intelligences, so this is these are chimps, human, and orangutans, and those they're more or less pretty similar. These are 2-year-old children compared to apes and orangutans, pretty similar in terms of intelligence. Except look at this one. The intelligence of children. And there's a wonderful book on which I don't think I put up by a person by the name of Thomas L. This just came out a month ago. And the significance of children being geared from the earliest stages, and compared to this is wonderful thing about the book is it compares it to gorillas and chimpanzees especially. And so, what is so different about us, about our children, is the amount of social intelligence. So chimpanzees is their own world. They do some things together, but not very much. But our children, from the very earliest stages, are geared towards being able to work together. From the time it's initially the mother, but then it quickly expands. Thomas Ellis' book is great. Michael Thomas Ellis. I don't think I put it up. So, anyways, I got that. I've run out of time, and so I'm gonna stop at this. But what I want to say in conclusion is that I think that during this time, when we were being formed as a species, and our conscience was being put together, and that love became important to be able to function in these little communities. God is love. There's nothing more central to who God is than love, according to Scripture. And so I happen to think that God was there in their midst in ways that we might not be able to understand yet. I mean, this is just not really speculation. God is love. So if these communities were little communities, I mean, not to say there weren't problems, obviously there would have been problems, but if these were communities in which love reigned in some fashion, then God's Spirit was there. And God was present in these little communities, shaping us through God's Spirit, the Spirit of love. And we could spend much time. This is very early in terms of the studies to to talk about the details. People need to think about this kind of thing. But and this particular passage is from Romans, which talks about the conscience being there before, and it talks about the origin of conscience before they knew about Jesus. And so I happen to think that there's good reason to think that the Spirit was at work in special ways, because God is love, and if love was in these little communities, God was in those little communities too. Speculative in a sense, but thereby God is created. Run out of time. Thanks so much for listening. And we're ready to address questions.